I grew up in the late 80s and early 90s in the rugged hills of Appalachia. And I guess in a lot of ways, my childhood was a lot like any other kids out there in the deep hollows. Now, I watched a lot of TV, went to church with my family wherever we could. And my brother and I even had ourselves a Commodore 64. But then, since we grew up in what could only be described as a strict and very insular religious cult, TV consisted of purely faith-based programming. Whenever we could meet every day and twice on Sundays, and even our Commodore games had to be scripture-based, as nothing remotely secular was permitted. And the best way I can describe it, it was like living in a bubble, or maybe more like a sealed vault in the winter times. Now, we were part of one group and then another. And then one day, we were on our own and with just my elder Martin, the shepherd, the faithful, which consisted of my own family, and a handful of others living on a remote mountain homestead. Life revolved around the Bible and farm work. And we start our mornings at 5:30 a.m. with communal prayers in the old tobacco barn the men had painted black and repurposed as a chapel. And we prayed to God to protect us through the impending end times. But then if someone got sick, we dedicated a lot of prayer time to them. And boy did we need to, because my elder called us to reject all forms of modern medicine in favor of purely spiritual healing. Now he called it the devil's crutch, and that a person who utilized it was wearing their lack of faith like a badge of honor. And it's two such incidents which shaped my belief system growing up. One for better and one for worse. I remember the winter my little brother came down with something that I now realize was probably pneumonia. We prayed day and night while Martin laid hands on him, trying to draw out the demons that so plagued his body. We even fasted for a whole day, as penitence and self-denial were believed to be very powerful methods of what Martin called purgation, but which I came to understand was punishing oneself before God. There were no doctors, no antibiotics, just anointing oil and spoken prayer around his body. And then when he pulled through, Elder Martin declared it a miracle. Now looking back, it was probably just sheer luck that my brother survived his bout of illness. And we were indescribably happy that he had, but not every child survived the winters. And I remember attending not one but 2 winter funerals before the age of 10 where the coffins laid to rest were heartbreakingly small. Now, we didn't report any births or deaths to the state, and I'm pretty sure Martin found a way for us to avoid paying taxes, too. I know we had money, but aside from things that they could use to indoctrinate us children, we tried to avoid any kind of luxuries, especially modern ones. We did a lot of bartering with nearby settlers, and my dad's generation was the last to have things like birth certificates or social security numbers. Outsiders were considered worldly, which, contrary to what the word actually means, was not a good thing to us on the homestead. The faithless were to be pitied and evangelized from afar, but never trusted or mingled with. Our little cloister had to be absolute. So there were no public schools, no trips into town without strict supervision, and no friends beyond the kids from the other families who lived with us. Daily life was a mix of joy and fear. Summers meant berry picking and swimming in the mountain stream with bonfires where we'd sing and share testimonies of faith. But all that was to distract us from the fact that we were right in the middle of the end times and the outside world was about to crumble in Satan's grip. Winters were harsh, huddled around wood stoves or memorizing scripture by flashlight whenever the generators were on the fritz. You think Christmas time might be an excuse to live a little, but Martin declared it to be co-opted by the greed of the faithless. We got together on Christmas to have dinner and pray together, but the rest was spent in the big black chapel praying in thanks for the birth of our Lord and Savior. I find it strange when people these days talk about the 90s in the sense that outsiders had this shared sense of culture, or what the Germans might call zeitgeist or spirit of the times. They talk about Seinfeld VHS tapes and MTV. But for me, it was like watching through a cracked fence. We'd catch glimpses of the Gulf War on the TV, which was terrifying for us because Martin considered it as further evidence that we were living through the end times. He said all those tanks and soldiers would soon be turned on us and by a government that didn't just reject God, but embraced Satan and all his demons. The internet was a way to spy on us. Ruby Ridge and Waco were further proof of a government that hated us. And then forget about Y2K, which was Martin's favorite sermon subject for about 3 months straight. We drilled in preparation of government raids, hiding in cellars with weapons close at hand. To the point that when people talk about life back in the 50s when fear of Russian bombs were at their highest, I think it sounds awfully familiar actually. But now, since I've told you about the event which confirmed my faith, my brother survived his illness, allow me to tell you about the one which destroyed it. Not long before my 15th birthday during the fall of 1997, my grandmother Martha was making dinner for Martin when she suddenly attacked him with a knife for what Martin claimed was no earthly reason whatsoever. Looking back on it, I think he said something to her, something which finally drove her over the edge and filled her with a murderous rage. I don't know exactly what that thing was, and it's obviously pure speculation on my part, but whatever it was that happened that day, it sent my grandmother into a frenzy. I saw her myself as a group of men folk dragged her off to the chapel, her home and hospice for the next several weeks, and she was well and truly beside herself. She was kicking and fighting, screaming and hollering. And I only recognized her by the dress that she was wearing, too, because the men marching her off to the chapel had to wrap a cloth around her head to keep her from biting them. It was horrifying to watch, and all I could do was run to my mother to ask her what was going on. At the time, she didn't know, and it was only later that she came to tell me Martha had been possessed by a demon. Now, watching my hysterical grandmother dragged away to be shackled to a bed in the old chapel was beyond horrifying to me. And so, it might come as a surprise to some of you that I was actually very optimistic in the days that followed. I believed wholeheartedly that Martha would be fine because not only did she have Martin at her side day and night, laying hands on her and reciting scripture, but she had everyone on the homestead praying to God on her behalf. We couldn't use the old barn-turned-chapel anymore, and not since Martha had taken up residence there. But on Martin's direction, we prayed in our homes instead and begged God's forgiveness so that he might cast the demons out of grandmother Martha. Now, I had no doubt in my mind that it all worked. After all, it had worked when my brother was sick. But over time, Martha didn't seem to be getting better at all. And instead, she only got worse. She slept mostly during the daytime, so school and morning prayers were mostly quiet. But at night time when she woke up, we could hear her screams from our homes. They weren't loud as the barn was quite a distance away from the residential buildings. But they were always there, lingering in the background after dark, and they'd last until Martha either lost her voice or passed out around dawn. I didn't find this out until much later on because they didn't tell us kids everything. But one morning, Martin came back from tending to Martha all night, looking pale and deflated. He normally came back tired, but content and confident of Martha's recovery. But that morning, he seemed anything but. He told my dad, his son-in-law, that he'd come to learn something during the night, something which terrified him. And I apologize in advance for the theology lesson, but it'll help you understand why Martin was so terrified. So, Apollyon is a really scary dude. It's supposedly one of the princes of the abyss, which is a badass title if ever there was one. And in the Bible, he's described as the king of the locusts. So, basically a force of pure destruction. And it also has the ability to sting like scorpions. That means from a purely fundamentalist Christian perspective, Apollyon is the very last prince that you'll want to be invaded by. His spiritual sting makes it very hard to dislodge him from a host's body. And his swarming nature denotes an extremely corrosive effect on said host. But then again, some of you might be surprised at how happy Martin was when he realized this. You see, he had no doubt in his mind that God would grant him the power to defeat Apollyon. After all, he was on the righteous path. But what's more, the Bible prophesies that the destroyer will be unleashed during the end of days. Basically, Martin believed God was granting him the opportunity to defeat the Prince Apollyon, prove his worth to the righteous, and bring about the end of days. Obviously, in this context, end of days simply refers to the rapture, which from a fundamentalist Christian perspective is like the best thing ever, I guess. And so, now you understand why Martin was so terrified when he realized Martha wasn't getting better. It wasn't just that he was losing her. It's that if Apollyon really was about to claim his wife's soul, it was because God had deemed him unworthy of the honor and had promptly deserted him. And if God had deserted him, then he'd deserted us all. I obviously wasn't privy to this information, but I felt Martin's fear. We all did. We heard it in his sermons. We read it in the lines on his face after those late nights praying at his screaming wife's bedside. But above all, we felt it when he had us encircling the barn, man, woman, and child to pray aloud for Martha's mortal soul. She screamed and wailed throughout that whole affair, yelling things like, "He's the devil. You need to get out. Get far away from here." And at the time, we thought they were the words of a demon prince. And now, I think they might have been the wisest words to grace my ears in all my young life. And when we were done praying, we all went back home to pray some more before dinner. We ate in silence, trying not to hear the screams as that monster I called an elder resorted to quite literally trying to beat the devil out of my poor suffering grandmother. And finally, after weeks of waiting and worrying, my parents told me it was time to wish grandmother goodbye. We all lined up outside the barn and went inside in our 2s and 3s, and it was quiet by then. Martha was too weak to scream anymore. And so after we shuffled up to the grubby old mattress that she was lying on, she didn't say a word. She was looking at us, but I don't think she saw us. You know, I think Martin might have done something to her head and I don't know what, but something bad. All she did was take shallow breaths and stare at us blankly as we said our tearful goodbyes and then walked out of that barn. Martin stood watched the whole time, looking empty-eyed and defeated. He was a man who'd failed, a man whose God had deserted him, and it ended up being the end of him. After grandmother Martha passed away and we held a little funeral for her after laying her to rest in our secret cemetery, Martin went into a period of deep prayer. The chapel stayed off limits as Martin would head inside every day and kneel by the side of that old mattress to pray for Martha's soul. At least that's what we thought he was doing. But looking back on it, I think it was more like he was going there to starve himself and reflect on what he'd done with his life. He lost weight, his sermons got shorter, and we'd see him out of the chapel less and less and less until one day I heard that he got up early in the morning, wandered off into the woods, and was never seen again. My dad, who took over his duties as his male heir, claimed that he must have been taken by the angels to go be with Martha. I don't know exactly what had happened to him personally, but I can hazard a guess. Once he was gone, things stayed the same for a little while, but with my dad at the helm, things started to get much more lax around the farm. One big contributing factor was our need for an attorney, and someone had the bright idea to groom one of us kids as the farm's pro bono attorney after pitching in to put us through college. Well, since the oldest and smartest kid was me, I'm not bragging. I'm just saying I was picked to be the farm's undercover agent in the outside world. Get educated, become an attorney, come home and defend the farm. And this was their plan anyway. But needless to say, it didn't work out. Seeing what they did to grandmother planted the seed of doubt in my mind. Going to college poured a whole bunch of water all over it. I had to pick a private Christian college. I couldn't pick anywhere. But transitioning from a fundamental Christian homeschool environment to an actual college just tore my whole worldview apart. I still believe in God in a manner of speaking. Anyway, but at college I encountered all kinds of Gnosticism, Mondaism, and Manichaeism. And it had me questioning everything, not just what I'd been told by Martin and my parents. Then the more I realized I'd been taught a lie, the more I realized my grandmother hadn't simply passed away. She'd been murdered. And I entered a period of deep clawing depression. Not just because my entire worldview had collapsed, but because it was too late to bring Elder Martin to justice. The only thing that gave me even the smallest flicker of hope was the idea that my parents, along with the others who'd kept grandmother starved and confined to the chapel, could taste a small portion of that same justice. I was planning on cutting them off anyway, at least until I could find it in my heart to forgive them for what they did to me. But when I called the cops in that area and told them all about what had happened with my grandmother, I knew that they'd do more to rubber stamp that family divorce than anything I could possibly think of. The cops paid them a visit, asked some questions, and concluded that there was very little chance of gaining any convictions given the man with all the answers was now deceased. I figured that was the case, so I wasn't too disappointed. But the tension I felt when my parents' letters started appearing in my school mailbox was on another level. I had to deny it was me. I couldn't come clean until I'd finished my education. And I actually didn't come entirely clean until I'd saved enough money to pay my college back and could walk away from my family with only a small souvenir of guilt. I just wish I had the guts to do it in person, because when it came time to confess my attempt to get them arrested, I could only bring myself to do it by letter. I didn't have to fear the flurry of correspondence that would have come if I hadn't added a little postscript, one which detailed me moving someplace they'd never ever find me. But I sometimes imagine how furious my father was. But furious or not, he cashed that check, and with that I bought my freedom. As I said earlier, I still believe in God, just not in any sense Elder Martin would ever sanction. I honor my mother and father by praying for them. Not every night, but most nights. I don't know if they've seen the error of their ways or even if that old farm still exists anymore. I just know I can't be friendly with a man who had a hand in the murder of his own beloved mother. I can't tell you my name or where exactly I am currently, but I know that I am a young woman who grew up in a small, isolated village called Koska Range. Koska was home to around 500 people, families who had been there for generations. We had a difficult time living from the land, while the rest of the country seemed to rush past ahead of us in politics and technology. Winters were terrible, with temperatures dropping as low as -40 degrees Celsius or even lower. Snow would pile up so high that we would have to make tunnel paths between the houses. We would burn wood or coal in our stoves to stay warm. And trucks had to be left running all night sometimes just to keep the engines from freezing. Summer was better, much better. But there were still things which made it hard, like the middle of summer where there was daylight for almost a week, or the swarms of mosquitoes that plague us at night and leave us with bites. But summer also gave us the chance to gather berries or fish in the rivers. Because even during the easier times of the year, our lives revolved around survival. As the oldest daughter in a family of 5 children, I helped Mama with household chores from a very young age. I would help milk the goats, feed the chickens, and I would help chop firewood, too. And this was a very important part of our lives because the only heating that we had came from a traditional stone fireplace. Once the sun had risen, we would bake bread and make oatmeal for our breakfast. Our school was a one-room building a few kilometers away. And we were taught math, English literature, and history. But that history was simply a mix of local lore and horror stories from the early 90s when everything fell apart after the economic crash. And after school, I'd help tend the vegetable garden in summer or mend clothes by candlelight in winter. The meals were simple. Potatoes, cabbage, pickled mushrooms from the forest, and whatever meat Papa could hunt or trade for. My grandmother, a tough elder who survived the Great Isolation, taught me embroidery and herbal remedies, and told us how life was better when the old territory laws were in charge. We didn't have much, and we didn't get internet until 2011, and even then only at the community center. But since electricity was unreliable, blackouts were common, especially in remote areas. So sometimes there was no TV or radio at all. As a teenager, seeing pictures and videos online made me long for life in a big city like Vancouver or even Toronto where a girl could study or find a job. But for children from the territories like me, opportunities in those places were few and far between. Little did I know, but one day I would get my wish. But we have a saying in the North, be wary of your desire. One night in the winter of 2022, the village was awoken by the sound of a very large and very loud explosion. The boom of the explosion woke everybody up, but it sounded very distant as it was so high in the sky. But then the shock wave hit us, making everything rattle and shake, and you could hear the sound of children crying in their beds all over the village. I called out to my papa to ask him what was going on. He said he didn't know as he put on his boots and clothes and then ran out into the snow to look up into the sky. We all did, some not even bothering to put on shoes or overcoats. And when we looked up into the sky, we saw it. There was a huge fireball, so large I would never have imagined it possible had I not seen it with my own eyes, and it lit up the sky like hell itself had replaced the clouds. We all stood there watching as the flames burned out, turning out smoke so thick it blocked out the moon. And then the first pieces of debris started falling to earth. It was just small pieces at first that pitter-pattered off the roof of our homes like raindrops. But then the larger pieces started to hit the ground, too. And those did not sound so pleasant, especially not the pieces that screamed as they burned. We had to take cover in our homes as pieces of whatever had exploded above us smashed into our houses. It was the most scared I had ever been in my life. And my mother and father used their own bodies to shield us as large pieces of metal began smashing into the house. I have a memory of my father rushing to soak a blanket in water before throwing it over a piece of flaming debris that had smashed through our roof. He stopped our home from burning to the ground, but others were not so lucky. 8 people lost their lives that night and almost twice the amount of homes burned to the ground. In the morning, we looked outside and gasped at the destruction. We were used to taking care of ourselves, so we did not expect any help from the regional government. Not for weeks or even months, anyway. So, when a large number of specialized units arrived that very same day, we were all very happy. But they were not there to help us. Not really. And the first thing that they did was tell us to stop attempting to clean up and repair our homes. They were not there to help us rebuild our homes. They had arrived to take us away from them. They explained it was too dangerous to stay there and that if we joined them at a camp that they had arranged for us, they could feed us and treat our wounded until it was safe to return again. This we welcomed much more readily, and the officials were true to their word as conditions at the camp were good. Their medics treated our wounded and we were all interviewed by the same pair of officers who were very sympathetic and consoling in their questioning. We had suffered a terrible tragedy and they simply wanted to figure out what had happened. They also assured us that our home would be rebuilt and we'd be able to return as soon as it was safe to do so. But this was just one of the many lies to us, and soon it became clear that something strange was going on. Apart from a few particular incidents, we were never treated poorly by the units or their officers. But they did make it clear that the additional medical examinations that we were subjected to were not voluntary. People who had cuts, bruises, or broken bones treated were being dragged back into the medical tents to have their blood drawn and their bodies examined. This happened to everybody, too, not just those that had been hurt by the falling debris. And it happened again and again and again. They were testing for something, and they would not tell us what they were testing for. And after weeks of this, of living in tents and eating processed food, there was a small rebellion in the camp and we demanded to be able to return to our homes. The high-ranking officers told us that that area had not been repaired and rebuilt yet, so it was not safe for us to return. But we were sick of being told this. My dad said repairs would take no more than a week at most if everybody shared the work. But the engineers had supposedly been working on it for 3 weeks and with nothing to show for it. In the end, the high-ranking officers told us that they would figure something out. And we took this to mean that they were returning us to Casca Range. And instead, they announced that we were being moved to a secure facility outside Montreal. After a journey of many days by train and road, we arrived at our new home. A towering apartment block surrounded by many others just like it. But once closer, we saw ours was much different. There was a fence and guards. Medical facilities had been set up on the bottom floor. Although we were supposedly free to come and go, a person needed a series of security clearances to do so, which made things impossible for people who wanted to leave. And the same routine played out for us. More standardized food, more medical tests, and more interviews with different officers about what we saw in the sky that night. And I told them the same story over and over. Explosion, fireball, debris, then terror. And there was nothing more I could tell them because that was all I knew. But still they asked me many questions like they were waiting for me to say something that would finally satisfy them. Now for weeks we were told that Casca was finally being rebuilt after the engineers had cleared away all the rubble and debris. But even when they said it was finished, they still found reasons to keep us in that apartment block. My father applied for a leaver's permit again and again and again. And then over and over he was told no, you did not have the right paper, or no, you did not complete this paper properly, and had to go back to start again. I remember my mother crying one night and asking if we could ever get to leave that place. And then one day my father came back to our apartment with a big smile on his face and told us we were leaving. I only found out later, but my father told me that he had found 2 guards doing something that they shouldn't have. He didn't say exactly what that thing was, only that they would be in a lot of trouble if their officers found out what they were doing. The 2 guards asked my father what he wanted in order to keep quiet. Apparently, we were too special to simply murder to keep us quiet, and he told them he wanted to leave with his family. My mother was terrified. She believed it was a trick and that the guards would murder him. But it was no trick. Their word was true, and the next time my father applied for a leaving permit, it was granted. We were only the 3rd family to be permitted to leave the apartment block. And when my father met with the father of another family, he was warned that things were not over for us. The man was working as a janitor to earn enough money to travel back to the north, as the government would not give him the money themselves for him to travel. Another sign that they did not want us to return. But that was not all. He realized that whenever he left the apartment that they were renting for just a few dollars a week, he was being followed. Sometimes by 2 men in a car and sometimes by 1 man just walking, but he was certain of it. Papa said that then he made a decision that he would leave the country and seek asylum in another country. I can't tell you which country this is for reasons of personal safety, but we were very happy to be granted a hearing based on claims of medical experimentation. Papa said the person he talked to from the government here was appalled kai ho navy what we had all been through. And Papa even spoke to another man from the government who asked more questions about the explosion. We've been waiting for our application to be processed for a long time now, but we are very sure that asylum will be granted to us. Sometimes I worry no se kong and we will be forced to live in another place for another long time while we wait once more, just like in the camp in the apartment. But this is only my second biggest fear returning to my homeland. My first question is, what will happen if they come for us? My name is Killian and I'm from Dublin. And when he was still with us, my old granddad, God rest his soul, told me a story that I think you'll enjoy reading. He moved to Dublin back in the 40s when he was still a teenager, so his dad could work in the shipping docks since the war was on. But he grew up in this little coastal village called Unexplained. The name comes from the Irish Gaelic for a nose. And if you look at Unexplained on a map, the peninsula that the village is situated on really does look like a big old schnoz. But don't let the name fool you, because I visited Unexplained with my granddad and it really is beautiful. But it's also a place with a very dark secret, albeit a very open secret these days, and one my granddad let me in one day after a few too many drams of whiskey. And so back in the 1900s, before World War I, Unexplained was exactly what it is now, just smaller. It's this charming wee village with no care in the world, full of smiley happy people who all said hello when they passed each other on the shore road. There's a beautiful golf course that the town sort of sandwiches, so Unexplained would get all kinds of bigwigs and wealthy types coming through and making the cafe and pub owners very happy, lightening their pockets. Everything's going wonderfully. The police constable has nothing to do but stroll around whistling to himself until one day when the town's post office suddenly burns down. And in doing so, it unleashes a scandal of what at the time was considered epic proportions. The post office was first spotted ablaze just after sunset in October. And although the townsfolk fought bravely to douse the flames, the post office burned to the ground overnight. Fearing the postmaster and his two assistants to be victims of the blaze, the village constable enlisted two trusted men in sifting through the rubble. Then when he was finished, he announced both good and bad news. The good news was that no human remains have been located among the ashes, meaning the postmaster and his assistants were no doubt still alive. The bad news, on the other hand, was that they appeared to have absconded with over £1,000 belonging to the town's post office savings bank. The trio consisted of the postmaster, a Mr. O'Shea, who was a middle-aged bachelor, and two spinsters, Mrs. Gallagher and Mrs. Brennan. Since none had any family in the village, it stood to reason that they'd be inclined to abscond. But the village was still shocked to its absolute core, as it constituted the town's most high-profile crime since the 1700s, when a gang of smugglers murdered the village officer while bringing goods to shore. At a village church service one Sunday, the priest invited the town's policeman to address his congregation. Constable Murphy announced that he was doing everything he could to bring the trio to justice and return the stolen money. He was even working in conjunction with police forces in Dublin and Belfast, and that officers in Dublin believed that they were hot on the trio's trail. Not even a week later, Constable Murphy had more good news for the congregation. Police had raided a home in Dunlaegare, believing it to be the missing trio's safe house. And by the looks of things, O'Shea, Gallagher, and Brennan had fled just minutes prior. But they left behind a large bag of banknotes. The post office savings money had been recovered. Now, naturally, the money's return was the cause of much celebration around Unexplained. Celebrations the pub landlords were only too happy to facilitate for their own financial gain. But it was all a lie. The truth didn't come out for another 25 years. Not until one of the men who helped Constable Murphy sift through the rubble of the post office was on his deathbed. Constable Murphy himself had long since passed away following a short but valiant battle against an aggressive cancer, and had resigned to take the secret to his grave. Yet, one of the men he trusted to do the same eventually proved he could not. He was said to have expressed a deep remorse at helping tarnish the good names of two innocent women in Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. Gallagher, because not only had they not been involved in any kind of plot to rob the post office's savings, there had been no such theft at all. According to him, This is the true story of what happened the morning after the fire. Having been up most of the night trying to put out the fire, most of the village was still asleep during the dawn hours. This gave Constable Murphy and his 2 hand-picked men plenty of time to comb through the ashes of the post office alone, which is how they found the bones of the postmaster along with his 2 assistants. The men were obviously bemused as to why the trio hadn't escaped once they realized there was a fire. The post office was a relatively small building, so it's likely they noticed something burning fairly quickly. But upon examining the post office's 2 doors, they discovered both had been locked tight. And not only that, but the keys appeared to have been in the clothing of the postmaster himself. Since the scene didn't make any sense, the constable asked his 2 pals to keep watch over it while he gained access to the postmaster's home. He intended on searching his home for clues to what had happened. He didn't have to look past the kitchen, though. On the table, Postmaster O'Shea had left an extensive handwritten note describing exactly why he chose to lock himself and his 2 assistants in the post office before personally setting it on fire. And the note was long and rambling, but the essence was this. O'Shea believed his 2 assistants were, as he phrased it, no longer who they claimed to be. He claimed they posed a significant threat to the people of Nsran as well as the wider world. And since their power meant that they could not be outmatched in a head-on confrontation, O'Shea explained that he had no choice but to use the only means available to him. He would suddenly lock the post office, set it on fire, then keep the 2 beings, the word he used, from escaping before they died from smoke inhalation. Murphy later told one of the men guarding the post that it was the single most disturbing thing he'd seen put to page. The ramblings of a madman. And if word spread of what the postmaster had done, there was no telling how it would affect the village and its people. And as I mentioned earlier, a big portion of the village's income came from the nearby golf course. And if the wealthy stopped patronizing it while staying in the village hotels and drinking in the village pubs, then it would have a terrible effect on its economy. There was also the matter of reputation, something which was far more important back then than it is now. But above all, Constable Murphy knew that having such a terrible, murderous insanity visit Nsran would have an indelible effect on its people for generations to come. There'd be rumors of hauntings. The story would traumatize children, and all kinds of penny dreadful journalists would come slithering around poking their snouts into places they didn't belong. And so Constable Murphy made what you might call an executive decision and covered everything up, sacrificing the reputations of the deceased for the reputation of the village. A dying man spoke his piece, and the secret was out. But since it was only spoken around a few choice relatives, it didn't exactly spread like wildfire. Instead of spreading overnight, it took years of quiet whispers for the truth to spread. And even then, many dismissed it as a ghastly rumor spread by bored school children. But my granddad, on the other hand, swore by it. He said that one night in the year before his family moved themselves to Dublin, someone dug up Mrs. Brennan's grave in the middle of the night. It must have taken them all bloody night to do so, but I don't think they neglected to fill the grave back in or put the lid back on the coffin through lack of time. It was to prove that the grave of old Mrs. Brennan, whose remains were supposed to have been buried after perishing in the post office fire, was empty.